So a very warm welcome to Julia. The tables have turned today. She's going to be asking me about the book and all the stories that are contained within it. But I'd love you to introduce yourself, first of all, to the people watching and listening.
Hi, I'm Julia Davis. I run Yoga Teachers Forum, and Yoga Teachers Forum runs trainings for yoga teachers who are already qualified teachers. And we have a beautiful range of teachings for people who are perinatal educators. So they might be prenatal yoga teachers, postnatal yoga teachers. They might be doulas, midwives, or hypnobirth teachers as well. And that's really how my knowing Tessa has evolved, and we've worked together on a variety of projects. And I read Birth Pearl Wisdom and completely loved it. I love the variety of stories. It really rang true for me that there is such a wide variety of experience. And it was really lovely that you, Tessa, have worked with people in their first birth, second birth, third birth, or some people have come to you maybe having had a more challenging first birth, and that experience has been completely turned around working with you. So I wanted to start today by really asking about the origins of the book. Where did the idea come from?
Well, the idea originally was just to put lots of birthing stories together, because when people have had their baby, they often send me an email or a text message or something. And it might be the day the baby actually arrives, which I'm always amazed at. Sometimes it's months down the line, but people often go into a lot of detail because they'll have heard somebody else's birthing story during the class, and they got so much from those stories that they want to sort of pay that forwards. Because for me, it's the little details, the nitty-gritty of somebody's experience that you gain so much from, rather than if you read more of a sort of textbook type of, this is how to do this technique and that technique, you don't get the flavor of the twists and turns of the birthing journey. So I had all these amazing stories, really diverse. So like you say, they're very positive, but often there are twists and turns in them. So there are stories about induction, caesarean, VBAC, vaginal birth after caesarean, same-sex couples, their experience, real mix, home births, water births. And I just felt there's so much power in women telling their stories. There are a few stories from dads as well. It's that, almost if I could have that oral history, that would be even better. But I thought the next best thing is to put it into a book that's accessible, and women can learn from each other then. That was the main idea. But then as I was putting it together, and I thought, somebody's talked about the golden thread technique, the golden thread breath. I want to unpack that and explain it to somebody who maybe has never heard of that. And so it got bigger and bigger. And I started to think how important it was to support the inner journey by asking questions that the expectant parents could then reflect on and think, is this something that I actually need to do some work around? And then point people towards further resources. So the idea is that, somebody might not kind of do lots of work on every chapter of the book, but there might be one specific chapter they go, oh gosh, actually, I realise looking back that there is something powerful there that I need to deal with in the situation of labour. So for example, there's a lady I remember, really lovely lady. She was coming to the class for the first time with her third baby. And we were talking one day after class, and she was saying how in the first two, while she was at home, it was all unfolding beautifully. And then she arrived at a hospital, and then something changed, and both times the labour slowed down and she had to have more intervention, and she wanted to try and avoid that the third time. So in talking to her, I more and more got the feeling that it was something to do with modesty, because she converted to Islam, and she normally wears a headscarf and covers her body. And in talking to her, I realized that she felt very exposed in the labor room. And so I did a birth preparation workshop with just her and her husband, and we talked about how the husband could really help in getting involved in conserving her modesty, and that might be just physically putting himself between the door and her, so she feels like there's that initial physical barrier, that he's sort of protecting that space. And we talked about different ways that she could let the health professionals know that that was important to her.
That's gorgeous. That's
it's just sometimes realizing those things, those values that are incredibly important to you, and thinking how is that going to unfold in that kind of situation when you might be with a health professional midwife that you've never met before, who maybe doesn't understand what's important to you.
Yeah, it just shows the individual is so important, really seeing the person. What I was thinking about with this book is I read it as somebody who'd had children, not intending to have any more, and it reads beautifully as a story. It's a really lovely sort of book to read. But reading it, it's looking at who you had in mind, because I love the idea of a first-time mum reading this book, or a first-time parent. Did you have, when you were writing the book, were you imagining who was going to be opening the pages of that book? And, we work with birth professionals, so it may well be that you had some birth professionals in mind also when you were thinking about who might be reading it.
Yeah, initially, it was, I suppose, thinking about first-time parents in particular, because I think once you've been through a birthing journey, you have a sense of the intricacies and how things can change, and how doing some kind of preparation is really helpful. The first time around, you might not always really realize that. And I thought through the stories, they can get a sense of the diversity of what happens, the diversity of things that people find helpful. It just opens up a new world, really. But I was also thinking about people like doulas, that actually it'd be amazing, if you have a group of doulas, that you could use it like for a book club and work way through it, and as a way of sort of processing the kind of births that you're attending, different things that come up. So yeah, I think a wide range of people have actually been reading it, which is lovely. And for me, it's the power of the story. And there are websites out there, like Tell Me a Good Birth Story. That can be a good place to start looking for positive stories. But there's something about having a book that you can take with you. Maybe you're commuting to work or by your bedside, and you can just dip in and out. And perhaps you get a favorite story. Every time I get a birthing story come through by email, I still have a bit of a cry because it's just such a special moment. And I remember every one of the ladies that is in this book so clearly. Another story that really stands out to me is a lady, Hilary, her name is, and she's just finished coming to mother and baby yoga with me with her second. But with her first baby, and she's mentioned in the book, there's not the whole story there, but she's mentioned, she, keen cyclist, cycled all the way through her pregnancy. And the plan was that when it was time to go to hospital, her neighbour would give her a lift in the car, because they don't own a car. And of course, that particular day, the car was in the garage. So her husband rang for a taxi, and they said, oh, it'll be half an hour to arrive. She said, I don't have half an hour. I'm going to get on my bike. So she cycles. So from where she lives, it's at a normal speed. When you're not in labour, it would probably take about 10 minutes to cycle there. So she set off, and every time she had a contraction, she stopped and she paused, and then she'd carry on her way. And her husband followed after with car seat. I don't know how he managed that on a bicycle, and the hospital bag. So she arrived at hospital very soon afterwards. They found that she was fully dilated, and an hour after that, the baby was born. So the midwives apparently were joking that was going to be their recommendation, that people cycle. And it goes to show, how important it is to keep active. So if you're already cycling and you feel comfortable, keep cycling, And obviously it's not always that straightforward. But I love those kinds of stories, because I think sometimes people are afraid of sharing a good story because they feel like, I don't want to upset somebody who's had a difficult experience, but we need a balance. It's so important to give people a sense of what is possible.
Definitely. And I think we've both been watching The Yorkshire Midwife, and there was a complaint that it wasn't dramatic enough. And it's like, and both of us were cheering because we're like, there were some really beautiful, fabulous, positive birth stories. Everything doesn't need to be a disaster story to be enjoyable to watch and to read. I wanted to ask you about the people who were not the birthers, the people who are not giving birth in the stories, because there might be birth educators out there who very much work with the person who's pregnant and who don't necessarily have as much communication or spend as much time with their partners, their birth partners. And I know you share stories about people, some of them are their husbands, some of them are their partners, some of them their mothers, their sisters. It's not always the person who impregnated the pregnant person that has been present. But I'd love for you to talk about how you built relationships with the people who weren't the birthers, because like you say, you've got a couple of dad stories in there too.
Yeah, and they're from dads who came to birth preparation workshops with me. So I think that's why they felt comfortable writing their perspective, because they knew me, and we'd developed a relationship. And to me, it's so important that the partners get involved, and in some ways the earlier the better. Sometimes in the workshops, the partners will say, oh, this is the first time I really have connected with the fact that there's a baby in there, even though there's already a bump. But just for example, there's a sort of a visualization that we do, and I encourage the partners to have their hands in contact with the bump so they can feel the baby moving. And they often say, that's the first time I really kind of understood that there's a baby coming up, the birth is coming up, and I have actually an important role to play in it. Because sometimes there's a sense with first time partners, I think, that as soon as there's an initial contraction, you'll ring the midwife takes over the care of the labouring person, and that's job done. But actually we know that very often labour will begin at home. Even if you're not planning a home birth, you might be for hours at home. And the thing I often hear from first-time parents, and it can be quite bewildering, I think, for the partner if they're not prepared for it, is that if they don't know that they're going to be at home and be the sole support, there's a tendency to go in and out to hospital to see how far dilated I am. Can I stay yet in the maternity department? And it can be so dispiriting when you're told, no, you're not ready, you're not in active labour yet, you have to go back home. You're like, oh my gosh, but if you're not prepared, you haven't got these tools, it's very hard to be sent home and feel like, but we've got nothing, we don't know what we're doing. So this is the thing with the birth preparation workshops that I run and I do the training for, is that they're very practical. So it's very helpful to have information about interventions and the different things that can happen, but it's those practical tools around breathing techniques, about how you can make the person more comfortable by using something like rebozo, for example, help the baby's positioning. So in my classes and in my workshops, I do talk about pain. I know in some types of hypnobirthing courses, they ban the word pain, but pain is a signal that tells us something. And so if there's a consistent pain at the beginning of labour, that can be a signal that actually there's a malposition with the baby, that the baby's not in the most ideal position. And you can do so much about that if you know, with some simple positioning, movements, using the scarf to help the muscles relax so that the baby's got room to move. And so when, at the end of a workshop like that, it's almost like you can see them stand a little bit taller. It's like, okay, I feel like I've got a toolbox here now, that I know what my role is. I'm not on the side. I'm actually going to be actively supporting the birthing journey. And I think that is incredibly empowering. And that's what it's all about really in the workshops, is this giving this agency, read as much as you can around it. So You're not coming across, like if you've never heard of induction before, it's not really a great time to learn about induction at the moment they're suggesting you have it. If you have some sense of what it's all about, pros and cons beforehand, you're going to feel your nervous system is going to be able to cope with the situation much, much better. So yeah, for me, it's so important to get the partners involved, and I just think it can change the world. Just imagine all the partners that attend a birth and see a baby born, how amazing life is, the sanctity of life. You're not going to throw that away as quickly if you've actually witnessed that incredible process.
Yeah. I'd like to ask that because it's very, very clear from the book that it's about everyone who's involved. It's definitely not the story of the birthing person. It's to do with the space that's created, where they're choosing to be, and who they're with to support them. But often what happens is that there's like one person who, the person who's pregnant goes to pregnancy yoga classes, or the movement side of things, where they're going to learn what to do with their bodies and their breath and how to be, and also manage the pregnancy process for themselves. And there's like a separate piece, which is the birth education. And the birth education is done sitting with the partner, learning something in a slightly different way. And there's like, it's compartmentalized. And often, there's the pregnancy classes, which is with somebody who's like a yoga teacher. And then the education classes, which aren't necessarily with somebody who's got embodiment experience of movement. And when we're looking at birth educators, what can we do? I know you run the birth preparation training, but what can we do to explain the difference so that they understand that there's something very different that they would be getting from, for instance, specific birth education classes that they might receive for free in hospital, for example, and what could be given from somebody such as yourself who's got experience of hypnobirthing and yoga and a knowledge of how the relationship with the partners really works in the actual birthing room.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, really, because I always talk about the missing piece in antenatal education is the body, which sounds crazy because birth, however the birth happens, is a very, very physical process. So how is it that we keep not talking about that? We talk about interventions that kind of are done to the body. With hypnobirthing, we think about the nervous system and relaxation, but it's crucial in my eyes that not only the person who's pregnant, but also the partner has a chance to try out the positions and the movements. So that what I hear a lot from, say, if you go to the free antenatal course at the hospital, is that they'll show some photos of different birthing positions. And we know from research that just looking at a photo is not going to have the same effect than if you actually get in that position and you try moving your hips, you see what's comfortable for you. And if you can get the partners to do that too, they're going to remember better, and they can then say, oh, you haven't moved for a little while, let's see if we can find another position that's comfortable. Do you remember that one from the workshop? Because there are these big sensations going on in your body with the contractions, and you might not have the feeling to move into another position, but it's recommended. So, they say about every 20 minutes, shift into another position. So what I keep doing locally with my midwives is presenting all the research around pregnancy yoga. There are systematic reviews. There's so much information now showing how there are beneficial outcomes, shorter labor, better able to manage the pain, all sorts of things. So I would really ask any perinatal professional who's watching this, who isn't a pregnancy yoga teacher, is to say, try out a pregnancy yoga class, because that means often people are coming weekly, and week after week, they're trying the position so they don't feel weird. Like maybe you've never been on hands and knees, that's not a kind of usual position for you. But if you tried it week after week, it feels normal. you don't think anything about going into the room where you're going to have your baby and doing that position if that's what feels comfortable.
Yeah, that was something that came across very, very clearly in the book, was the idea that you can't just do something once and think, oh yeah, right, I've learned that, I'm going to do it. It's about it becoming part of who you are, so that when the mind goes out the window and the body takes over, the body knows what it wants to do. I wanted to ask you something about, because we're kind of looking from the world of like perinatal educators. And I'd love to ask you, because I know that your training, your birth preparation training is FEDANT approved. And I'd love to ask you, like my idea is that everybody who gets to know you, who gets to know the work that you do and who works with you, they could all be producing their own Birth Pearls Wisdoms book down the line. So they'd be like, okay, I work with Tessa, I'm really confident in running my birth preparation courses, and now I've got all these lovely stories, and I'm gonna write, it could be like, but 2, 3, 4, 5, you'll like hear them across the country and across the world. But I love kind of the idea that you've got, that we're all perinatal educators, so there's not like a yoga teacher in this box and a doula in this box and a midwife in that box. So if people are thinking about broadening their knowledge, and also I know that you help with the promotion side of things, so that people really understand how they're going to explain to parents what they're going to get from a birth preparation training. But I'd love to you to talk to kind of like who you see benefiting from the training that you do, and how that relates to the book as well, that you've written, because I think there's a really beautiful relationship between the training and what's come out of the book that you've written.
Yeah, just to talk briefly about the marketing side, I mean, it's very important, if you're going to be running workshops, that you feel confident about telling the world what value you can give, because a lot of people will already be doing NCT or antenatal classes at their hospital. They might already have booked on hypnobirthing before they come to your pregnancy yoga classes, but there is something unique that we can still give them, which is through that embodiment piece that we've been talking about before. But yeah, I've had doulas come to the birth preparation workshops, which is fantastic. And I work very closely with a range of local professionals. So I very often refer to a couple of chiropractors that are in the area where I am. So if a baby is breech, or the mum has terrible reflux, or whatever it is, I say I strongly recommend you go and see a chiropractor, because they can work magic. So sometimes it's needed to have some direct work on the body, and then also that other piece about moving your own body, getting to know your own body. They work really well together, and I find the recovery is much quicker if they've had something like chiropractic or osteopath treatment, because the body is primed. It's as good as it can be before you go into the labor, and it tends to recover well afterwards. So yeah, I tend to work really closely with other people around. Also, maternity reflexology can really help prepare somebody ready for, especially if they're going overdue and they want to get as ready as they can. So yeah, I hope that a range of people will use the book, because it's so important to have that consistency of care. And before the pandemic, locally at our hospital, they were working really hard to re-establish that consistency. So you would always see the same midwife. We know, again, there's lots of research on this, how important it is. And then the pandemic's disrupted everything. We've got issues with staffing levels. So, what I really recommend is that you find consistency with somebody else. So that might be your pregnancy yoga teacher that you're seeing weekly, and there's that reassuring face. It might be a doula. I think if I had a certain amount of money, instead of buying an expensive travel system, I would put it towards a doula. That is money much better spent. Get a second-hand travel system. The baby's not going to care,
I totally agree with you. I remember like thinking about that. I've actually just walked past one, and I just think, actually, there are really, really inexpensive travel systems. And so long as they can get from A to B and potentially look at you while they're getting from A to B, but you can carry them for a while, then that is so different to consistency of care. And I'm in London, and I think consistency of care within the actual health system, within many constituencies in London, has never been there. It's really, really unlikely. You can please do sort of contact us and say, no, I'm in London, I had wonderful consistency of care. But in the experience that I've had, that there is very little, if any, consistency in care. And also there's often the choice made to be GP led. And so if you're GP led, the care's not within the system, it's with a GP that isn't a midwife or a professional in that way. So having somebody there who's actually involved in the world of pregnancy and isn't just going to be testing your blood pressure and your blood sugar levels to check that everything is okay can be really so useful. And that idea of the conversations continuing, so that doulas are talking to midwives, are talking to hypnobirthers, are talking to pregnancy yoga teachers. If we're all there together, I know you run the State of Birth Symposium, and one of the kind of raison d'etres of that was to hear all the voices, to hear the voice of a birth doula next to the voice of someone who shares yoga nidra for birth, next to the voice of somebody who is a midwife working within a clinical environment. That is something that is so important. I would, highly recommend people come along to that. I went to the last one. I absolutely loved it. It was so rich and easy to absorb and nervous system friendly. I wanted to ask you as well, there are a real variety of stories within Birth Pearls Wisdom, and as much as the final story that we hear could be a really positive one, there are also stories that start with a really challenging birth story. And actually, I'd like to, if without kind of saying things that should be kept exclusive and confidential. I know that you've worked with a variety of yoga teachers and birth professionals that have found themselves unpacking their own stories with you. And I just think it's really important to look at the trauma piece, especially as trauma has been bandied about as a word in the yoga world a lot. But when I looked at the idea of burnout and the areas that I found personal challenge with, it was when I was working with really challenging situations with people who, for instance, were having problems getting pregnant, had had a birth loss, were facing giving birth to a child that they weren't expecting to be giving birth to because they knew that there were going to be physical or neurological differences in that child when it was going to be born. And that when I began teaching pregnancy yoga, there was no one there holding space for me. And those were massive, massive issues that I was dealing with as a teacher. So there's two sides to this. There's the side of, oh my goodness, we're holding space for a lot, and that some people are held in that. So maybe there are systems in place for midwives to be held. I don't know how much there is in place for midwives to be able to unpack the trauma that they experience through their clients. And what can be there for us, and also how we can actually support, because I can't imagine being a perinatal educator and not coming across trauma. I can't imagine that ever being the situation.
Well, it's like this sort of shadow side. I mean, it can be very joyful teaching pregnancy yoga and getting these lovely birth stories, and but unfortunately sometimes things don't go how we would want them to. And I have a feeling that if you're a doula, there's a better sort of support around that. So as you're doing your training, you're having supervision, and there's that continues. Whereas very often as pregnancy yoga teachers, we sort of go out into the world, and unless there's a kind of group of graduates that you can kind of lean into, you're pretty much on your own. And that's why in the birth preparation workshop training, it's hopefully feels like this safe container, and part of what we're doing is processing maybe your own birthing experiences if you've had children, or it might be you've got a sister or a friend that's had a difficult experience. What are your beliefs around birth? So we have time to unpack all of that, and I think that's incredibly important. And then I do a birth trauma workshop, which gives more space to that. Because I think birth trauma is different from other kinds of trauma, because when you set out to have a baby and you're going through the pregnancy, everybody is thinking about this joyful outcome. You're going to have this healthy baby. And when either, unfortunately, you lose a baby or something happens to the body, you know, the mother, it can be this sort of bittersweet situation. And anniversaries can be particularly hard because everybody's like excited about the birthday of the child, but you're carrying this weight of the trauma that's happened, and it can feel very hard to celebrate, you know, and have that joyful response, because your nervous system is triggered by coming up to that date again. So I think it's a very particular kind of trauma. And there's so much that we can do, you know, if we've got a pregnancy class or a postnatal group class, to minimize the risk of re-traumatizing somebody. So to give you one example, you might have to think carefully about lying on your back, knees bent, in that sort of semi-supine position, because for some women, they'll have been on a hospital bed, feet up in stirrups in a lithotomy position, and that just completely reproduces a situation, that physical position that they might have experienced trauma in. So, you know, one thing you might think about is in your registration form, when somebody comes to mother and baby yoga, is having a question around how the labour went. So I ask that, and sometimes I just get a sentence, sometimes I get a whole, you know, A4. When people used to write it, I've got it online now, but used to write a whole A4, you know, and that gives you a way into asking questions about, well, we might do this or this in the class. Do you think potentially that could be an issue? And then you can modify it for them and make it safe for them. And also another thing to think about is, generally when we're learning to teach yoga, it's all about command language. Now lift your right arm. You know, we're telling people what to do, giving clear instructions, but actually if you've got somebody who's experienced trauma, it's very helpful to use invitational language so that they can choose whether or not to do it. And it's just a little shift, like you say, when you're ready, or maybe try lifting your arm. You're just giving that little bit of choice, which can make all the difference to somebody feeling like, yes, this is a place where I feel comfortable, and keeping coming to your class. They might disappear and you never know why. And it might be because there was something triggering about the situation that you just have no idea about. Yeah. And that the trauma workshop is open to other people other than pregnancy and postnatal yoga teachers. So I think on the next one that I'm doing, there'll be a chiropractor who's very interested in knowing more, because they will sometimes give exercises, and making sure that you're giving that element of choice back to the person and sort of increasing their sense of agency.
Yeah, I mean, with your training in general, you'll always make sure that people know what level of insurance they need to do the education that they'll be providing, but knowledge-wise, it's really open to all birth educators rather than a specific type of birth educator. The content is useful for everyone, and also the relationships that you'll build with other practitioners. It's very nice if there's a variety of people there.
Yeah, it's like in the book that, you know, there's such a rich mixture of stories, and that was done on purpose so that, you know, you can learn that birth can go all sorts of different ways, and you open yourself up to that possibility. I think one of the key things with birth is it is a vulnerable state to be in, you know, and that can be very difficult when we might have spent all of our life so far trying not to be vulnerable. Yeah. Can we get to a place with having the consistent caregivers and thinking about our own history that we feel safe enough to be vulnerable?
Yeah, there's also the fixing, isn't it? There's the partner role, or the person who's being chosen to be there for the birth, and they can feel like it's their responsibility to fix things or to do something, and it's giving that person agency so that they know where they can be helpful, so they neither feel redundant nor like the world is on their shoulders and they're responsible for everything.
Yeah, because it can be incredibly empowering being a partner through a birthing journey. It can, I would say, revolutionize your life, that you feel like, wow, I had a key part to play in bringing this child into the world. And, I think it helps that initial bonding between, the child and the parent. So it feels very special to do this kind of work. It's a responsibility as well. And I think that's what's particular about pregnancy yoga, or anybody who works with this kind of group of people, is that you're constantly keeping up to date with current interventions. It's not like if you're a traditional yoga teacher for a general class, you're teaching very traditional practices. They haven't changed for thousands of years. But with perinatal, there's the context is changing all the time.
Yeah. So as we kind of come to the end of our chat, have you got any final words that you'd like to say about the book, about the State of Birth Symposium, about your perinatal birth education, the birth preparation education, and about the trauma? There's quite a lot there that we've been discussing.
Well, I wanted to show you the back of the book, because it starts with a lovely bump, and then at the back she's holding the baby. So we've kind of come from being pregnant to actually having had the baby. And I think the main thing I want to get across to people is put in the work, during the pregnancy, and that includes the partner as well, because it will pay off. I think sometimes there's a feeling of wanting to hide your head in the sand, and putting all your trust in that care provider. But the more you read, the more you practice that embodiment we were talking about, that you connect with your body, I think the better chance you have of navigating your way and feeling you come out the other end feeling positive. Even if it wasn't quite how you pictured it, you've felt in control at each point, because you've had chance to take on the information they might be giving you, feel how that lands in your body. And sometimes an intervention has to happen, but just having that little bit of space, maybe 5 minutes, to have a cuddle with your partner, to have that touch and get that oxytocin. Right, okay, this is happening, letting it land. That can make all the difference to, at the end, saying, yes, that was a positive, empowering experience.
Oh, that's really beautiful, that the way that you kind of described that. So thank you. I love the picture on the front and the picture on the back. And as birth educators as well, I think you've made a really, really key point, is that, yes, we're here to teach technique, or to teach how things can be, but it's that empowerment piece. It's that actually, it's not about us being there to tell someone how to do something. It's about sharing skills so that they can grow. I think you mentioned it. They leave the birth preparation workshop a couple of inches taller, because they own their own experience. And whatever that experience is, that's kind of what we're there to do, to help them own the experience that they have, so that whatever experience that is, it's one that they can look back on, so that when that baby's having its first birthday, they can look back and go, yeah, what a day. or what a 36 to 72 hours that was.
Yeah, because rites of passage can be hard, and we're not sort of saying that all of this is going to be easy, but when there's, you've dug deep, and you're looking at the truth of it, you're meeting the sensation, you're going towards it, rather than pretending it's not happening or trying to run in the opposite direction. That's what can make the difference, I think.
So I'm sure you're going to put in the podcast notes where people can find things. But with regard to the training, yogateachersforum.org, and then if you do / pre and postnatal, all the perinatal education comes up there. But I'm sure you'll share links to the specific trainings that you're providing. And the State of Birth has its own website of its own. It's the stateofbirth.com, stateofbirth.com, and that is a really delicious opportunity to meet with other people, and it takes place on Zoom, so it really is interactive. It's not webinars. They're not webinars where people are going to be sitting there talking at you. They are recorded so that you can watch them afterwards, but the intention is for you to be able to be there, be physically part of the symposium, so that you can ask questions and it can be as interactive as you'd like it to be, and for it to be nervous system friendly. We've got really lovely yoga nidra and dancing, so that you don't feel rushed that you've got to watch this and learn this, and everything's there for the long term afterwards as well. So it's really about enjoying the experience of being there, and then knowing that the knowledge will be there for you to revisit afterwards. So
I've asked the speakers,
go on.
I've asked speakers to, to bring practical elements in. So you might be learning some new information, but again, letting it land in your system. So, on the Monday morning when you go back to see your expectant parents, you feel recharged and you've got something to bring to them, nervous system to nervous system.
Yeah, so thank you for really being the kind of founder of the perinatal education family that you've been created. It is really, really lovely and nurturing to know that if you are a pregnancy yoga teacher, a doula, a midwife, and you're looking for community and for support, that you've created something really special, Tessa. And I know that you've built really beautiful personal relationships with teachers that have come to you to train, and clearly from birth pearl wisdom, beautiful relationships with parents that I know you see kind of walking down the street with their 5-year-old or 6-year-old.
Yeah. And thank you for your great questions, Julia.
I'm really, really welcome. It's been lovely speaking to you today.